The original Alan Wake was a wonderful game born from a troubled development cycle. It started off very promising, with the developers taking the time to conceptualize different ideas for their new game. This resulted in the project developing into a story-focused game with open-world gameplay. As the development progressed, Remedy found that the story and gameplay were not gelling together, and actually working against each other. The developers formed a team out of all of the team leads to take a hard look at their project, and determine what elements to keep and focus up their vision. This resulted in Alan Wake becoming a linear experience, while still using many of the areas that they made for the open world sections. While Alan Wake is beloved by many, it has remained a cult classic within the industry, but it also wasn't the only time we got to experience an Alan Wake adventure. Remedy made a smaller, more standalone title with a higher focus on action that would continue the story. Join me as we take a look back at Alan Wake: American Nightmare. Following the release of Alan Wake, Remedy opted to go in an unexpected direction with their potential series. Instead of diving into a sequel, they wanted to make a standalone spin-off experience that picks up the events after the first game. Alan Wake: American Nightmare would be a digitally only game, and would be the developer's way to expand the universe of Alan Wake. The plan was to make this entry more fast-paced and action-packed than their prior title. This was Remedy's attempt to challenge what it meant to be an Xbox Live Arcade game, and provide something new within that space while continuing their story. The story would feature Alan in a battle with his doppelganger, Mr. Scratch. Remedy thought of a creative way to set up their game in an episode of Night Springs. Alan was a writer on the TV show within that universe. The narrator from the show would narrate the events and help to begin and close out each area. The manuscript pages would be making a return, but not paced out in the same way as the original. Since the levels within American Nightmare would be more open, this gave the player the option to explore the levels for pages providing additional story. The player could choose to collect all of them at the start of a level, or opt to grab them as they pass some of the locations to complete a main objective. The light and dark mechanics would still be at the core of the gameplay with many additions. Along with this, players stated that an area that the original could have improved on was variety in the combat. As such, Remedy worked to include many more enemy types along with more weapons to make the combat encounters even more dynamic. The goal was to use what was built in the original and then build off of it and better those certain areas. This would factor into the growing sense of escalation that Remedy was trying to provide within this title. New enemies would be introduced to the player as they progressed, with some of the harder ones reserved for later in the story. Some of the new enemies included a grenadier, where Remedy wanted to have an enemy that could damage the player from far away as other enemies would close in for a melee hit. Also, as a means to play around with the light and dark mechanics, one enemy would react differently if you shined your flashlight on them. The new enemy, the Splitter, would split into two enemies if you hit them with your light. The feedback that Remedy received from Alan Wake was that players loved the story and setting, but they wanted more of it, including even more action. This is where the idea to include an arcade action mode into American Nightmare came from. In this mode, the player would need to survive for a set amount of time, using only the supplies within the level to aid them. These stages would only focus on the action and would have a scoring system for leaderboards. Oddly enough, this is the mode that started the development for the entire game. Remedy started playing around with improving their combat, and then opted to grow their game into having a campaign as well. Alan Wake: American Nightmare was a way for Remedy to continue their story with Alan Wake, along with providing another entry point for new players. They also wanted to provide something completely different within this Xbox Live Arcade space, by providing a hefty amount of content for a $15 title. In February 2012, Alan Wake: American Nightmare was released to the world. Alan Wake American Nightmare is a third-person shooter with compelling combat and an interesting story premise. For the most part, the action remains the same as the first title while providing some appreciated improvements, like better enemy variety and more weapons to use. The story is not as deep or complex as the original, but rather acts as a fun detour before we hopefully get a full sequel. I like to look at American Nightmare as a standalone expansion to the first, as it retains what made the original awesome while creating something unique for itself. This game also offers an incredible amount of value and presentation for a title that launched at $15. Just like with their prior game, I love this one as well.
Mount Redtooth, its top littered with man-made eyes that stare into the endless depths of space. Tonight, the champion of light will depend on them to pick out a message from the ether.
The bulk of the action is centered around the third-person shooting. Just like in the first, most of the enemies will be covered in darkness, and you need to burn that darkness away before you can damage them with your guns. Your main means to do this is with your flashlight. Needing to manage your battery level and ammo helps to create a dynamic set of tension for the encounters. The shooting is great as it retains that expected high quality of sound effects, feedback, and impact from your shots that you would get from a Remedy game. Essentially, the weapons have an excellent punch to their shots, adding to the intensity. Enemies react accordingly to the different weapons that you get to use, and this is where the shotguns cause enemies to fly or flip back. The cinematic elements from the combat in the original are here as well. The game will go into slow-mo to communicate to the player they defeated the last enemy in the group, along with being used to highlight when you dodge from an attack. Many of the same items return as well, like the flares to push enemies back, flashbangs to remove light or outright kill enemies, and the very powerful flare gun. American Nightmare does a great job at providing more weapons for the player to use than they had in the original. You have a few different pistols, a magnum, SMG, nail gun, shotguns, rifles, and a crossbow that can even pierce through the darkness. The other area that is improved from the combat is the enemy variety. You will have the normal Taken, and then there are splitters which will split into two enemies if you shine your flashlight onto them. Hybrid foes that are part enemy and part crow. Grenadiers which can even damage their own enemies, and much larger foes. Essentially, the combat system builds off the foundation from the original and enhances it in two areas that needed some more options. These new enemy types are slowly introduced to the player over the course of the campaign to keep things interesting. American Nightmare does what you would want from a continuation in a series. It reminds you why you enjoyed the original and improves where it is needed. The campaign is set up differently than the first one. You will traverse 3 large areas. The game will point you in the direction of your objective, but these spaces provide you with a good amount of exploration and you're rewarded for it. Similar collectibles return, and here the manuscript pages help you to unlock new guns. There will be these chests that you find, and they require you to have a certain amount of the pages to unlock them. Exploring is a great way to increase your supply of flares, flashbangs, and flare guns. This is not the most extensive open areas you have seen in a game, but for a $15 title, it provides more than I initially expected. One thing that you will notice is how you can run longer than in the first game, which is greatly appreciated. If you explore and try to obtain all the collectibles, the campaign can take you from 4 to 6 hours to complete, and once that is completed, you have the endless, entertaining arcade mode to enjoy. This essentially is a horde mode where you try to survive for 10 minutes, along with seeing how high of a score you can get. There are 5 maps to play through along with harder versions of those same maps. The arcade mode is an absolute blast and an excellent addition to Alan Wake. The first time you play a level, you will try and learn the layout of the items and weapons, and then you can play around with improving your score. Dodging every enemy attack is very satisfying since it massively increases your combo. And with this being a Remedy game, there is a large focus on the story, and it's pretty good here as well.
man before you is a champion of light. He is part of a conflict between darkness and light that is both ancient and eternal.
I really like the premise for the story. Essentially, Remedy came up with a smart way to provide a reason why the player is playing the same 3 areas 3 times throughout the game. Alan has escaped the dark place, but he's not sure how to get back to reality. He is stuck in a loop where each time he tries to take down his doppelganger, Mr. Scratch, he gets sent back to the start of the loop. We get to see a more confident Alan here, and one more comfortable in his earned heroic role. Alan Wake 1 was about seeing him grow and turn into this hero, where in American Nightmare we get to see him up against a very compelling villain. The time loop situation is very interesting, but it is Mr. Scratch who helps to bring this narrative to life. Anytime he is on screen, he steals the show. He is a nice mixture of campy, funny, and menacing. He commands the room and is a great villain. Some of his best moments are found in these collectible TVs that have some enjoyable live-action cutscenes. The cast is smaller this time around, and the side characters are entertaining. You can opt to partake in some optional dialogue, and some of them can be pretty funny. There are other elements to help sell this Twilight Zone type feel, like having the narrator from the Night Springs TV show from the first game narrating this game. Radios are in each of the areas and provide some insight on what Alan Wake's friends are up to in the real world. The manuscripts return as well and offer you information on what is going on in the real world, Alan's friends, and clarification from the first game. Like I said before, this feels like a well done expansion to the first game, rather than a full sequel. The story progresses the narrative in some areas and gives us hints to where they want to take the story, but do not expect large jumps forward in the narrative. While the story is not on the same level as the first, it is well done and keeps you interested with the action. When this game first came out, I was very impressed by what Remedy had to offer. This launched as a $15 game and looked just as good as the prior full game release. It offered about a 5-hour campaign with a great action horde mode. Overall, this is a great entry, and there are a few areas that could have been improved on. Due to the concept of being caught in a time loop, you will be running through the same 3 areas 3 times throughout the campaign. To Remedy's credit, they tried to change up the combat encounters during the loops by having parts of the objectives on the second and third loops completed. There are also these parts where you need to change objects in the environment to play out a scene, but they are very simplistic, where these could have been these fun, light problem-solving bits. And lastly, I love the survival mode, but it was a missed opportunity to not have a 2-player co-op option. That mode is perfect for it, and it would have been great to play it with a friend. Overall, American Nightmare is still a great game. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to praise the soundtrack. The new tracks are great and enhance the action. Here are a few tracks from the game. Alan Wake American Nightmare is a great companion piece to the original. From a gameplay perspective, it retains what made the light and dark mechanics so compelling, along with improving the combat with more variety. The enemy variety was greatly increased, along with the different weapons that the player could unlock and use. These additions made the already compelling combat even more dynamic. The story was a creative and unique experience, as we play through an episode of The Twilight Zone as Alan tries to break out of a time loop. And after the narrative is done, the Horde mode provides hours of content. If the original Alan Wake was a full season of a TV show, American Nightmare was the TV movie released between seasons. Remedy has continued to make it clear that they care about this franchise and would like to continue it. The best example of this is how Alan Wake was featured in his own DLC within the game Control. I hope that Remedy gets to come back to Alan Wake someday and properly close out this story. I highly recommend American Nightmare, and thank you very much for watching.